PG&E also operates 42,000 miles of distribution mains and serves 4.4 million gas customers. But given our limited time today, I will focus my comments on the gas transmission system. All of us who work and live in California have to take the risk of earthquakes very seriously. As we heard earlier today, in the San Francisco Bay Area, the probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in the next 30 years is estimated at 63%. PG&E, as you saw earlier, has an in-house team of 14 employees who are experts in geosciences and who lead our earthquake risk management efforts. PG&E's priorities as they relate to earthquake preparedness are to protect the public and worker safety, to minimize the damage that can occur during an earthquake, and to restore service quickly and safely after an earthquake. After the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, PG&E conducted several studies to determine the impacts and vulnerabilities of our system. These studies indicated that the gas transmission system is generally resistant to earthquake damage and is expected to be operational in the event of an earthquake. This has proven to be the case in the Loma Prieta earthquake and most recently in the magnitude 6.5 Ferndale earthquake that occurred in January of last year. In both cases, there was no significant damage to the transmission system. There are, however, two areas that PG&E continues to review and focus on to ensure and reduce earthquake vulnerability. The first is our above-ground facilities that require anchoring or bracing either at our control rooms or at our above-ground stations. PG&E has completed this work and has retrofitted 370 facility projects. The second issue is pipeline earthquake crossings. PG&E has mitigated to date 15 pipeline earthquake crossings and has plans to modify several additional fault crossings in the coming years. In addition to this work, as part of PG&E's Pipeline 2020 program, we will be proposing the installation of automatic shutoff valves on several pipelines that cross earthquake faults. Specifically, our plan includes high consequence area pipelines greater than 8 inches in diameter that cross an active fault with a greater than 2% probability of an earthquake occurring in the next 30 years. In addition to the issues I just discussed, it is important to note that PG&E's risk management program, which covers all gas transmission pipelines, also includes the risks associated with ground movement. Ground movement risks do include fault crossings, but also include landslides, levee crossings, and liquefaction, among other things. These risks are not solely focused on earthquakes. However, the engineering and mitigation work associated with ground movement will improve the gas transmission system's overall resistance to earthquake damage. In terms of emergency response to earthquakes, PG&E has developed an earthquake playbook. Those objectives cover all gas and electric facilities and ensure that all organizations have a plan for preparedness and recovery and that all plans are synchronized. These plans are exercised and gaps identified and resolved on a regular basis. Specific to the gas transmission system, PG&E has developed a tool to prioritize the transmission pipelines and facilities based on criteria such as ground movement, shaking levels, fault crossing locations, landslides, and high consequence areas. This tool is designed to automatically generate a list of activity that should be looked at anytime there's a magnitude of greater than 6.0 earthquake in our system. It helps us to prioritize any inspections and repairs that may be necessary. While we hope to never have to utilize these tools, we are prepared in the event of a major earthquake. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And our next speaker, Joe Rivera, Director of Gas Engineering, Southern California Gas Company. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk a little about SoCal Gas and San Diego Gas and Electric, and in particular our readiness for an earthquake event. I'll go quickly through this PowerPoint presentation, which I believe you have. If you look at slide number 2, this is just a map of our service territory to give you a feeling for the size of area that we're responsible for managing in a prudent, safe manner. We go from the Colorado River all the way to, obviously, to the coast, all the way far north as San Luis Obispo, Fresno, and down to the Mexican border. So it's a huge area that we're responsible for serving. I lost count, probably 100 different communities. If you move to the next slide, natural gas infrastructure that we're talking about, just like PG&E, we have a large transmission system, 4,100 miles of transmission pipelines. These are the high-pressure, large-diameter pipelines. We have 4 underground storage facilities, 13 compressors, 110 miles of distribution pipe, that's mains and services, and over 6 million customers. And the two that I want to really point out is the underground storage facilities and the compressor stations, because these are really critical in a major seismic event. If we were to lose our major pipelines, our interstate pipelines, this is what would keep our customers in service. They'd be those storage fields, as well as the compressor stations that move the gas. On the next slide is just an overview of the things that I want to cover today. One is our earthquake hazards reduction program. We've had this program in place for the last 25 years, and I just want to hit the highlights of that. That includes seismic upgrades, replacement of existing pipelines, hazard mappings, earthquake studies, even some studies that we've done in conjunction with PG&E. So as far as our history and what we've learned, we've had 11 earthquakes in Southern California in our service territory since 1933. The magnitude 5.8 to 7.3. And in 5 of those earthquakes, our system did sustain some significant damage, but not damage that couldn't be repaired within a matter of few days and put back into service. One thing that we learned from our earthquake, in particular the Northridge earthquake, that they're very localized. Even though you may have one area where there's intense damage and damage to the infrastructure, the majority of the rest of the service territory is still in good shape. So unlike things like El Nino, where you have significant landslides, you might lose 2 or 3 pipelines. In an earthquake scenario, it's much more localized. A couple other things is that we're anticipating that in Southern California, the fault systems there couldn't generate more than an 8.0 magnitude earthquake. And in addition, as far as our pipelines, the San Andreas Fault, where we have pipelines crossing in 2 areas, down in Indio and also in the Cajon Pass, that they're in remote areas, and if those pipelines were to rupture, they do not create a significant safety issue for the public. You know, I won't go through these next slides in great detail, but you can see since 1984, we've gone through a whole series of steps to improve our pipeline system, from doing seismic upgrades on all our above-ground facilities, new transmission lines going under new design criteria for crossing faults, 10-year large-scale program to get rid of pre-World War II pipes that are vulnerable to seismic damage, a fault crossing program for our existing pipelines, where we're going pipeline by pipeline, doing assessment of that crossing, and making upgrades to protect that system. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, we also did a joint study, comprehensive study with PG&E after Northridge. And out of that study, there are a lot of things that were developed. In particular, the one thing that came from it is that there was significant upgrade in the industry as far as design of pipeline crossings at fault lines. Page 6, in 1996, we did mapping of all our geohazards. 98, again, the Uniform Building Code changed, so again, we had to upgrade all of our above-ground facilities. We had another 3-year program to get rid of pre-World War II pipe. And then the big thing that's really changed the industry, in 2002, the new pipeline integrity rules came out from DOT and PHMSA. And weather-related and outside force threats became a very, very important part of our pipeline integrity program. On the Northridge earthquake, we found that the damage was really limited to those older vintage pipes. Our plastic system did great, and the good thing is that now 90% of the distribution pipe that we put in the ground is plastic. We have less and less steel in the system. One thing we found is that of the 150,000 or so outages that we had, 88% of those were caused by the homeowners, and prudently so. You know, they shut off their own gas, even though there wasn't any damage to the house itself. And restorations were completed in 3 weeks. So we had a lot of lessons learned that came out of the Northridge earthquake. And I won't get into the Northridge or through the comprehensive study we did with PG&E, but that presented a lot of information for us that we were able to apply to our system. Some of the things that we did find is that pipelines are going to do pretty well unless there's significant deformation. And if you got displacement of anywhere 3 to 4 meters, there's no modern pipeline that's going to survive that. It's going to rupture, no matter what you do. So, that's a key issue. You can try to protect the pipeline on a major fault crossing, but no matter what you do, the potential it's going to rupture. There's new industry seismic design guidelines that were completed in the late 90s, and we've done countless efforts looking at research to improve our design of our pipelines. Last 2 slides are on our earthquake readiness. The good thing about the SoCalGas and the SDG&E system, they're very redundant. We have a lot of flexibility in the system, so if you lose a portion of it, you have the ability to reroute gas. We can reverse flows. We have multiple out-of-state supply receipts. We even have an international receipt down in Mexico and down in San Diego Gas and Electric. We have offshore and onshore production. The 4 storage fields that we have give us that backup and that the comfort that we have gas supplies available even if we lose our pipe system for a while. And we also have automatic shutoff valves. These are line break controls that in an earthquake, in a major crossing of the pipeline was to rupture, the automatic shutoff valves would isolate that rupture and keep customers downstream and upstream of that pipe system or of where the breakage occurred still in service. So the bottom line is, in summary, when you look at our systems, we're very confident that we've designed and maintained our systems to withstand a major quake. And when I'm talking about a major quake, I'm talking about something in the order of the scenario that USGS put together for the Great Shakeout exercise. And that's about a magnitude of 7.8 on the Richter scale. Now, but don't get me wrong, I just want to make it clear that we can withstand that type of quake, but we're going to have ruptures on our pipelines, we're going to have outages, but they're going to be manageable. And in the end, we'll be able to keep up with the demand on the system once we make repairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation as well. And our next speaker is Richard Clark with the California Public Utilities Commission. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Senator. At the California Public Utilities Commission, we conduct inspections and audits of the operations and the maintenance of the utilities and the emergency responses of the utilities to ensure that they understand and work to reduce the probability and the consequences of failures due to ground movements. We ensure that they take probability of ground shaking, the probability of surface faulting, and susceptibility to soil liquefaction, and susceptibility to slope failure or landslide into considerations when they design their systems. And then we ensure that in their patrol inspections and in their leak survey inspections that they, number one, do them as required by law, and that they find what they should be finding and they fix whatever it is that they find. We ensure that the utilities have implemented safety measures to minimize threats from earth movement in areas prone to seismic safety. The oversight of utility gas safety has moved from a prescriptive system to a risk assessment system. It's actually risk assessment is layered on top of the prescriptive rules that existed before, and those are manifested in the transmission pipeline integrity management program that's been in place since about 2002, and then the distribution pipeline integrity management program, which begins in August of this year, August of 2011. Each of those programs requires that the utility determine that earth movement is, if earth movement is a threat to the integrity of a covered segment of pipeline, They must implement measures to minimize the consequences of the segment, and they must increase the frequency of patrols or add external protection. We review their risk management or risk assessment algorithms that they use in their transmission pipeline integrity programs and the one that they will be using in their distribution integrity management program. We review their emergency plans, and then in the aftermath of an earthquake such as happened in Eureka in 2010, we send our folks out into the field to evaluate that which has been done. Lastly, the Commission has undertaken a very comprehensive rulemaking when it comes to natural gas safety. Two elements of that impact here are we're looking at automatic shutoff valves and remotely controlled shutoff valves when it is that we should require those, the installation of those. And then we're looking for improvements in the emergency response programs of the various utilities that we regulate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Alquist has some questions, but following on the comments by Mr. Clark from PUC, my question to you, well, let me just say thank you. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the legislature that the PUC has been taking such an active role since the time of the disaster in San Bruno, and in your work in pushing for automatic shutoff valves and remotely operated shutoff valves, and also you work in decreasing pressure along gas lines. So I just want to thank you for that work. I'm going to have some additional questions with regard to the placement of these and the fault lines that you are targeting at PG&E. But let me stop for a moment and allow Senator Alquist to answer her question, or ask her questions, and then I will follow on behind her.
Thank you very much, Senator Corbett. Yes, I do have 3 or 4 questions. To PG&E, to Mr. Johnson, thank you for being here. What percentage statewide, or let's at this point talk about the Bay Area, because I would imagine that's a high consequence area. What percent of your pipelines that cross earthquake lines at this point have the shutoff valves that you were talking about? What percentage?
The shutoff valves that I was referencing were for high consequence area pipelines that actually cross the fault and that can't be mitigated through any other means, such as moving the pipeline.
Yes.
Or doing trench design or standard design to avoid the movement. In terms of what we are proposing, we haven't finalized those numbers, but we're probably looking at having to add about 9 valves to handle that for the entire Bay Area.
And what area in the Bay Area would it cover? I'm not interested in city by city, but are we talking about 40 square miles, or what is the extent of what we're talking about that needs to be done in the Bay Area?
In terms of the Bay Area, we have several crossings we're still looking at. We've done 15 already. We have several more to do, and then we have about 9 locations we're looking at to add the valves. They're scattered throughout the entire San Francisco Bay Area, but most of them are going to be in the San Andreas Fault and the Hayward Fault. That is where most of the activity is in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's also some minor activity up on the Rogers Fault, which is north of there, but there's very few pipelines in that area.
And I would like for this committee, if we could get a copy of your timeline of how many shutoff valves we're talking about and when this will be done, if you could get that to Senator Corbett to be distributed to all of us. Would that be possible? Absolutely.
We'll be making a formal filing with the Public Utilities Commission soon, and we'll make sure a copy of that gets to you.
I really appreciate that. Pardon me? A couple other comments. I truly hope that in this area, and I've had very positive dealings with representatives from PG&E, But if I look at the whole corporate picture structure, as one who lives in the city of Santa Clara, I have been truly frustrated, and it's not just a PR problem, with how long it took PG&E to come forward with information about the San Bruno blast. And I truly hope that, and I hate to think, and I'm not going to even pose it to you as a question, but if you had taken what happened with the pipelines in San Bruno and put that together, if there had been an earthquake, even just being a 6.0 on the Richter scale, I hate to imagine the consequences of that. So I'm not going to ask you what you think they would be, but I think it would have been exponentially disastrous. So I'm really hoping in this area that PG&E as an entity, as a corporation, will do whatever it can to quickly take care of this, because, you know, an earthquake could happen tomorrow here. It could be 10 years, it could be tomorrow. And I think it's within PG&E's responsibility to, and it would help PG&E to quickly come forward with what the list is of the valves and where they're located and when they will be fixed.
Well, thank you, Senator. We appreciate those comments, and we understand there was a lot of frustration around San Bruno. The NTSB is leading that hearing. A lot of that information was confidential. However, we completed the hearing several weeks ago, and we can talk about the majority of that information now, so we'd be happy to meet with you again and talk through the specifics of San Bruno and what has happened there so far to date. In regards to our proposal for valves, whether they be automatic valves or remote control shutoff valves, we did make a proposal, a preliminary proposal, that looked to add 200 to 300 of those valves. We'd be happy to share that proposal with you. And again, we'll get you a copy of the final proposal we make to the CPUC.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And my last comment back on the San Bruno, because I and my constituents have been affected by this. And particularly the condition of some of the lines underneath my constituents' homes, even. I mean, I think when PG&E said that part of the issue was a computer problem, that it was not able to identify which of the pipelines had the old connecting valve. I forget what it was called. But when we say things like it's a computer problem, what we really know is human beings devise the system of what goes into a computer and what comes out. And so it's going to be really important that PG&E be fully responsible, and I can tell from your tenor that you are. And so I would really like to see what occurs from here and hope that it happens in a positive fashion.
Well, thank you. And again, all that information now is publicly available, so it's obviously not the time today to talk about those issues, but we can certainly talk at length about what happened in Milpitas and the area that you cover. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator LaMalfa.
Thank you. I'll try and make it real quick. I just wanted to, I'm curious how it works and if the two companies can provide specs on how the modern pipelines work as far as flexibility and the absorption in earthquake, and because primarily using that light green gas line you see, is that what that material is you see on rail cars, etc.? Is that the new plastic you're using these days?
Go ahead.
The plastic that we use is primarily for, or not primarily, it's only for the distribution system. So it's for low, what we consider medium pressure pipe. Pipe that typically between 20 psi to 60 psi. So what you see, that the green pipe that you see is, that's part of the green coating, the fusion bonded epoxy coating that's used on steel pipe.
That's still steel.
Yeah.
And those are obviously your main lines, the big stuff.
Exactly.
Are those the ones that have a lot of concern about the shearing and earthquakes, or are they generally pretty self-sustaining, and you're just more concerned in the neighborhoods?
No, it's really the larger diameter pipelines that cross the major faults, like the San Andreas. Near India, we have two of our intrastate pipelines that come from the Blythe area. They cross near India. Both pipelines cross there on the San Andreas. So that's where they're most vulnerable. And as long as
external, then do those go external with like flexible links on each end, that sort of deal? Or?
No, there's things you can do. There's things where you can do things like a special trench design, trapezoidal design with loose backfill, so the pipeline has a chance to move. It isn't constricted by the soil. There's geosynthetic fabric that can be used. It uses a liner, again, to separate it from the soil, give the pipe some flexibility.
This is the sort of thing that if you have that you provide to the public, or for those that are really technically interested in the types of things, I'd like if you could provide those to my office. Just
sure.
Because this is something that does come up in conversation or town hall type issues, and I'd like to be able to see that. If you
there's a whole set of new industry standards on what you can do on fault crossings, where you can lessen the chance of a rupture of a pipeline.
And lastly, how's PG&E doing on its replacement of pre-World War II, the really old lines, and what percentage is that, and is it an ongoing full speed effort to keep going that direction?
Yeah, we continue to have what we would call the gas pipeline replacement project. That has been in place for since 1985. It's a 30-year program. We had a significant amount of pipeline to do. I don't have the exact numbers, but it was in excess of 2,000 miles to complete, and I believe we're about 92% complete so far year to date.
Very impressive. How about for San Diego?
I'm sorry, Senator, again?
How far along are you on replacements?
Well, most of our pre-World War II pipeline is gone. There's still some left. I can't tell you exactly how many lines are left or what the length of those lines are, but we're on the last part of that replacement program.
All right, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a few last questions, and take a point of personal privilege because I represent the Hayward Fault. And I know PG&E is very familiar with that. Thank you, Senator Lamoffler. The statement by PG&E earlier was that 15 automatic valves have been installed at earthquake crossings. 15 are done. You're going to be doing 9 more, and they're going to be being done on fault lines that have the most possibility of a quake in the near future.
Let me just be clear. We have completed the redesign and reconstruction of 15th earthquake faulting. So just as Mr. Rivera mentioned, there are new design standards we use for trenching, piping, thicker walled pipe. That would be our first approach before we go about putting a valve that has potential issues with it. The valves are used on lower probability pipelines. So any pipeline that crosses a fault, and there are many, many faults in California, that has greater than a 2% probability of a failure in the next 30 years and is greater than 8 inches, that's where we're looking to put the valves if we can't do it through pipeline design.
And that would be the Hayward Fault?
And there are, some of those may be on the Hayward Fault. Most of the Hayward Fault activity we can deal with through pipeline design.
Okay.
And that would be our preferred method, is to either reroute around the issue or to design a pipeline that can go through and withstand the forces we would expect to see.
So my question is, how closely do you define a fault crossing in looking at this sort of general map of the Bay Area fault lines and having some general understanding of where the major PG&E transmission occurs at the curve of the Bay in my district near Milpitas, Fremont, etc.? It appears that that's not exactly a fault crossing area. So are we talking within a number of feet, miles of actual fault line? Or help me understand exactly what on a crossing means.
Typically, when we're talking about a crossing, we're actually crossing the fault. We're going through the fault, either at an angle or directly perpendicular to the fault, and that's where we would have special designs in terms of trench or wall thickness or pipe design. If it's near a fault, if it's, whether it's 50 feet or a mile away, the pipeline design is based on the actual ground movement we would expect to see if that fault actually were active or that earthquake became active. So the actual crossing is truly having a pipeline cross over the actual fault line.
So in areas of slip strike faults like the Hayward Fault, we're really only talking about actual crossings, even though there might be very great seismic activity alongside a fault line as well because of the nature of the type of fault that it is?
It could be. In terms of if we have a fault, what we will do for specific to the San Francisco Bay Area, we have 8 major locations we worry about in terms of the scenarios we run, and that will generate actual ground movement, if you will.
Right.
And we can design around ground movement. Pipelines have a lot of give in terms of movement, but there are pipelines that are earlier vintage that we talked about earlier that need to be changed out because of that activity, and that's just the pipeline itself. What I was referencing is if it actually physically crosses a fault where we'll see a lot of displacement and a real potential for a rupturing of a pipe, which is where a pipeline will rupture is across the fault, that is where we'll implement special designs.
So, also, I'm appreciative of the increased emphasis on emergency response plans, and I know the PUC, of course, is pushing for this. I'd like to hear what PG&E's plans and SDG&E, Southern Cal Gas, whichever you prefer to be called today. What are the utilities doing, not only with regard to the request by the PUC for increased work on these response plans, but just as a result of what we have seen happen in Japan, what are you doing with regard to updating response plans to deal with natural disasters?
Well, I'll go ahead and start because I think we've been the one that's had the most focus on that activity in terms of the public activity. And we are working with SEMPRA jointly in reaching out to the Cal State fire leaders and the first responders so that we have a consistent message, and we're trying to create consistent efforts around emergency response. We still are focusing on very heavily getting the information into first responders' hands in terms of the pipeline locations and getting that technology in their hands so they have easy access to it, and that's been ongoing for a while now. We have several pilots ongoing in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we're also sitting down and working with them in terms of what do they really want to practice and run through. So we had an incident in San Bruno. We're all very well aware of that. And that became a major force for a lot of first responders to want to talk about how to deal with an event like this. We have had historically a lot of discussions around routine, I would call them routine leaks and that sort of activity, or third-party dig-ins, where they see those more commonly, and that's been the more typical response practice we've had. We have not seen an interest yet in earthquake response at the first responder level. Most of that has come from the cities and the counties and the county OESs who would have emergency response activities, and we are continuing to work with them also in terms of earthquake response.
SDG&E, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just add, Madam Chair, we've been doing things for a long time to make sure that we're prepared for earthquakes. We do these tabletop exercises. We do whole company exercises that are tied to earthquakes. We participate, like in the California Great Shakeout with Caltech as well as USGS. We have these intercompany agreements with PG&E to make sure that if we're short in a great emergency that they can help us out. And also we have the plans that with the first responders. But that last one is the one where we think that we can do a lot better. Typically in an emergency with first responders, we act as 2 separate units that really get together out in the field and then try to figure out a game plan. So our hope is that we're going to get ahead of the game. And we'll be already prepared to work as one unit with all the first responders in responding to certain types of accidents or certain types of major seismic events.
I appreciate that, Mr. Rivera. And my last question would be, and I'm sorry this is a little bit self-serving, there was a bill introduced this session, SB 44, which I introduced after, watching what had happened in San Bruno and having some very serious discussions with first responders in my district, and hearing that some of the more potentially dangerous pipelines that may need some upgrades happen to be in the 10th Senate District, in the Milpitas, Fremont area, Livermore area. I know PG&E, you're familiar with that. And after getting together with these first responders, this legislation was submitted, and the legislation would allow for much more cooperation and communication than has been happening in the past, I'm sad to say, between first responders and utilities. It would allow for some sort of protocol for the shutoff of pipelines. The shutoff would be done by the utilities, but in cooperation with the first responders or those that are in charge of the actual command scenario in a dangerous situation. And would also require, I know PG&E is working on this, but would require that appropriate maps be made available on gas pipelines, their locations, and other information necessary in order to make sure that there is an integrated and a response, so that first responders can have the appropriate equipment in the areas where necessary, and this mapping information would be coordinated with mapping information already made available with the fire departments. I know PG&E is working through some issues with regard to the technicalities of the distribution of the information. But I would like to ask that all of you, including the PUC at the dais, would consider weighing in support of this legislation. I think it's extremely important to allow our first responders the opportunity to respond quickly and with the information they need to make sure that they have the resources in the right places at the right time. In the event, I hope we never have to see another tragedy, but in the event that there is that sort of response required. So I know I haven't had an actual conversation with PUC or SDG&E yet asking for your support, but I'm hoping that this is a good opportunity for you to go back and find out if you would be willing to support this legislation. PG&E, we have requested support, and we're waiting to hear back, and I know that some suggestions have been made to us that we will respond to. So what do you think? Has anybody had an opportunity to take a look at SB 44? I know PG&E has. Any thoughts on whether you might be able to support this important legislation?
I haven't personally been able to see SB 44, but one of the things that I can promise you is that if it fits well within the components of that bill fit well with the things we're trying to do with first responders, obviously we'll take a real good look at it and see how we can support it. The one thing that I want to make sure is that however we help first responders, it's that it is truly help. I don't want to put them in situations where they're doing things that puts them at risk.
Right.
Things like having them operate valves would not be a good idea.
They have not asked for that.
Okay, good. but there's a lot of other things that we can do together that can help both parties.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Senator, I'm not sure if the commission has actually taken a formal position on it or not. I've not heard of any opposition.
Please do consider it, though.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And as you stated, PG&E is supportive of it. We do have some recommendations, but we're supportive of the concept.
Very good. Thank you all very much. And with that, thank you very much to the panel for being here. Thank you so much for your patience and being with us all day long. I do appreciate that. I think this has been an extremely important hearing. We do now have time for public comments. If we have people in the audience who wish to speak, we do have Greg Uhas, who is here, who would like to speak. Is that you, sir? Okay, please come forward. And if anybody else in the audience would like to, please so indicate. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ms. Chairwoman, and your panel. This has been a torturous experience watching you all listen and work so hard throughout the day. My name is Greg Uhas, and I live in Benicia, California, which is on the Carquinez Straits, in the center of at least 5 major refineries. But I also recently retired from University of California, Berkeley as a radiation safety officer. And in a former life, I was the branch chief for emergency preparedness and radiological safety at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I also work for the Department of Energy, and I consult the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm also a first responder as a part of the CERT group, which is the Community Emergency Response Team. So I wanted to take the time and drive up here today to listen to the sense of perspective, because I had a feeling your hearing would be hijacked by the public's perception of nuclear power and the risks associated with that. And I think it has been hijacked. In fact, the 15 minutes that was allocated to the other sources turned into 2 hours for the nuclear energy discussion. I think we have to keep in mind that 250 to 300,000 people died in the Haiti earthquake. 78,000 died in Indonesia, and 10 to 20,000 are dying or have died in Japan. None of those deaths were associated with nuclear energy. I was an investigator and an initial responder to 3 Mile Island. No one died at 3 Mile Island. The early deaths at Chernobyl were in fact limited to less than 50. There have been no one or no reported deaths to date in the Japanese disaster. So I think when we look at optimizing our energies and the expenditure of funds, we have to be realistic and recognize that most of the people die from pragmatic things like building zoning, construction codes, educational systems, evacuation routes. When we watch the films on Japanese TV, I am amazed at the discipline and the good attitude of the people who evacuated in a timely manner to the extent that they could and are following procedures. Those people that evacuated on the precautionary evacuation for the terrible fiasco at Fukushima went far enough out so that they are not likely to result in any adverse health effects from that exposure to radiation and radioactive materials. What we heard today was a discussion of hospitals and how many of those hospitals do not meet contemporary earthquake standards. During the Northridge earthquake, the VA hospital Northridge was shaped like a T, and I was responsible for radiological safety associated with that hospital because of its nuclear medicine department. That T shape was perpendicular to the ground wave, and basically the building opened up, and they had their their intensive care on the 3rd floor. And when it slammed back together, it was unreinforced concrete. People in the intensive care unit died trying to evacuate them out of that building. That whole hospital facility was lost. They were operating on their front yard in a first aid mode following a fairly minor earthquake. When the earthquake on Loma Prieta occurred, I was working for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I was in charge of emergency response. And as you recall, when the bridge collapsed and the Marina District once again caught on fire because of a natural gas explosion, people called us up and said, you should order the shutdown of Diablo Canyon. And we said, why? Don't you need electricity right now? Don't they have engineering safety standards that will ensure the core is protected? And you need that power as long as you can, because without it, you don't have electricity to run your hospitals or operate your radios or man your emergency response centers. So what I want to say is, don't lose the big picture here. The greatest return for investment are in the things that help people stay alive, like emergency evacuation routes, like building codes, like training for those folks. The nuclear power plant is all about profit, pressure, and pain. PGE and Southern California Edison are clearly motivated by profit. And you can bet that they'll rethink even if they want to bother relicensing those plants, unless there's a proper motive for it. You can provide pressure to a certain extent, but it's up to the regulatory agencies, which have been absent in this particular situation, that is the NRC, to educate the public with respect to what's really going on in Japan and with the plants here. Because the paradigm is it's all about PG&E or Southern California Edison. Everybody says they're the primary responder. We have to hear what they have to say. So that the government of Japan put very little information out. Their oversight group, the International Atomic Energy Agency, initially even failed to classify the event, let alone provide the public information as to the extent and what was happening or the impact on other nations. That's what they're supposed to be doing. Okay? Our own state organization, Department of Health, the Radiological Health Branch, is totally ill-prepared to handle the consequences of any major radiological event. So what I'm saying is, yes, the plans are designed. Bad things happen. That was beyond the design basis. But the consequences pale by more a factor than 10,000 of public health impact when it's the folks that are dying that we're talking about. How could we have saved those lives? Okay? Nothing really bad happened in terms of this huge accident that caused immediate fatalities. So I implore you that when you digest all this and you think about your course of action, don't lose sight of the big picture. What's the biggest return for that public dollar? Because it's really all about the money. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Uhas. I think it's important for you to know that this is just one of several hearings that I have held as chair of a select committee on earthquake safety and response. This is the first one that has reviewed utilities. So there have been hours and hours of testimony over the years on all of the other very important issues that you pointed out with regard to, you know more about it than I do, building codes, disaster preparedness. I'm very happy to hear that you're part of a CERT, very, very, very important parts of our communities, and all of the other issues dealing with building collapse and other, very sad occurrences as a result of an earthquake. So please don't go away thinking there has been any hijacking of a hearing. Today there was focus on utilities, but we also announced at the beginning of the hearing, I don't know if you were here, maybe, I think you may have been, that this is just part one, and part two will be a hearing of this committee following in about a month that will cover specifically hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. We didn't make that as part of today's hearing because we didn't want to give it short shrift. We started with a hearing that included all of those issues and knew that there wouldn't be enough time to cover them all to the length that they should be covered. So there will be another hearing where we will be talking about other issues that primarily will be focused around structural dynamics in the event of a seismic event. So thank you for your comments. All is not lost, and thank you for being here. This meeting is adjourned.